When you finish your professional career, it's like death. You say goodbye to everybody, get all your finances in order, and start a whole new life.
There's this camaraderie that you have with your buddies or your team members, etc. And then when you start playing, not only do you lose your rugby identity, your buddies are just gone.
Morning takes a year, you must wait and do nothing. Realize how much of your identity was collapsed into this rugby persona and this rugby world.
I think we all have some kind of identity. But what I've also soon realized is nobody cares. People care about themselves.
So there's this little committee, we call them the itty bitty committee between your ears. And then you got that man in the mirror. Yeah. You can't dodge it. It looks like at 50 you actually realize that whole identity was a bit fake and you got to build a new structural foundation.
Good morning. Welcome to Winning the Away Game, the show that shows what happens when life that first defined you no longer tells the whole story. If you enjoy our conversations, please make sure to subscribe to our channel on whatever platform you use it, so we can share more great stories with you. Today, we have two amazing guests. We have a finance leader and a prop, which is exactly the kind of episode I love. Jan Pieterse is Global Head of Business Development at Western Asset Management in sunny LA, and he keeps the African connection alive through the Dumela Foundation. Ollie Leroux was one of the great South African front row men. He's still around the game in 2025 as a coach, which means he knows exactly what it feels like to go from being the main event to having to find a new way to matter. So this episode is about discipline, second acts, and what happens when your first identity is not the full story anymore. Oh, I am so excited. Flippy, are you ready? And we have another two grey boys as guests. So I'm starting to be influenced by all these grey boys around me.
Justinus, it can only be a good influence. Yeah, I'm very, very honored to have one of my personal heroes, legends, Andre Henry, Ollie Leroux, and Jan Pieterse, two fellow grey alumni, with us. Jan, Ollie, how are you boys doing? Where are you guys today?
I'll start. I'm in Bloemfontein. I've been here since 2004. Before that, I was with the Sharks. And gentlemen, thank you. It's an honor to be on your show. And hopefully we can create some vulnerability out there. And it's an interesting story. Playing rugby and then life. It's two totally different things. So it will be great to hear the story. And what's nice is I haven't seen Jan. Jan hasn't told me his story. I've got some details about this. The foundation of it, okay. But one thing I knew he could jump high, so I know that we've translated that into the business world as well. So I'm excited to hear this one.
Flip, Justinus, Ollie, good morning from my side. Calling in from Pasadena, California. So we're about 15 minutes north of downtown. And like you said, sunny. If it's not 72 here, we complain. Fahrenheit, sorry. Because Ollie, you look a little cold there.
Yeah, no, we're in Bloemfontein, buddy. 4 seasons in one day.
We have a little tradition on the show where we ask our guests to recall their favorite Springbok memory. Jan, in this favor, because we have a Springbok, I'll let you go first, and you're not allowed to say Joel Stransky.
All right. So I actually thought about this, and really to come up with one favorite Springbok memory is almost impossible. I think, the 95 one is kind of the easy one. So I'm going to start out by breaking the rules, and I'm gonna give you multiple favorite moments, but I'll come up with a favorite, but I'll start with an honorable mention first. And I think the 2019 World Cup in Japan, I was lucky enough to be there. It was just the most amazing experience. Because, I mean, you are in a foreign country, as foreign as it gets, and the impact that had after the win on the nation building, the tour that you've had. I mean, that's got to be right up there. That was just the most amazing rugby experience. My second favorite, and I'm pretty sure this is going to be a first and a unique one, would be the 2023 semi-final versus England. And I'll tell you why. Again, I was lucky enough to be there in the quarterfinal the week before when we played France, and probably by far the greatest rugby match ever played. The intensity, the brutality, the accuracy. Actually, there was recently watched. There's a YouTube video of about 50 minutes, a documentary, also labeling it the greatest rugby match ever played. And I rewatched it the other day. That was our final. Right, I mean, France was by far the favorite. They beat up on New Zealand the first game, and so that was always the tough one. And so that's the one we had to win. And so that, from a rugby experience, the quarterfinal, just amazing. Well, of course, the night before was New Zealand Ireland, which was just as good of an intensive game. And so the semi-final was more of a formality. I mean, England was not on par. It was like we were going to win this game, and as we were playing, we were trailing. I don't know if you remember, we were trailing the whole game. And we were 9 points behind it's a low scoring game with 12 minutes left. And
Viking, baby, Viking.
Oh, exactly. He scored the try, but now we were still down. We had to score again. And we played it in our half, the most of it. And until that Pollard penalty was just barely in range. And the reason why, the feeling of that, the euphoria of when Pollard converted that kick was just the relief. And I think you guys can relate to that. Is it's a different emotion than winning. Oh, we're the greatest. It's the relief because it's something that you were expected to win. And I was like, that's kind of weird. And as I was thinking about it, but then I can also take it back to the Grey days. And Ollie, you would remember this very well. For us, it was all about the unbeaten season. You just don't want to lose. All right. And in our year, and I'm going to date myself here again, is 1991. We were on almost a 6-year unbeaten run. It was 90 odd games. The last time Grey lost was 1985, also against Joel Stransky, Maritzburg College. We ended up losing, that year. Actually lost twice, Monos and Paul Ruiz. But your whole career was just about don't lose. It's the fear of losing. And so when you think about, when you talk to great athletes, whether it's the tennis players or so, a lot of them, it's about they hate losing. And, that's, I think, is one of the things that they're always installed in Greys. They don't lose, protect, go on the unbeaten season. So that's my runner-up, number 2. And then I think my favorite, which is probably also, maybe no one else has mentioned this, my favorite rugby memory would be from 1981. Now, 1981 was the Springbok tour to New Zealand. Flip, I think your dad played in that. But remember, if we age ourselves here, 90, I would have been 8 years old. That's really some of my first rugby memories. You grew up, you had one TV, and the games were at 4 a.m. on a Saturday morning. And what we did as a family, mom, dad, sister, made a bed in the family room, like a made-up couch. And then we'd all get up at 4 a.m. in the morning and we would watch the games. And so, it's the highlight. We talk about as 2019 united a country and you bonded around rugby. So too, for us as a family, the fondest memories that we have as a family was that from 1981. That's one of my first rugby memories, but it also very, very special, family memories.
That is epic, baby. I was talking to Flip this week and I was saying to him, this intergenerational link that rugby built is so amazing. And you brought it up all on your own. I love it.
Yeah. This is great. Thank you for sharing that, Jan. I mean, there's so many people I crossed in my life. Actually, goes back to that the 1980s. Actually, 81 was a big part, and then 86 as well when the Cavaliers came, and how many families bonded. And I played with Ron Pienaar and Andries Becker, and we had their dads play there. So we actually became friends back then, and carried on through wherever we played. Yeah, so thank you for sharing that. Ollie, off the cuff, I just want to say you had a massive influence on my career. I never think I've officially thanked you for it. I did back in the day, but I was always, and I will always be a bit of a salmon, a bit of swimming against the stream, and coming through the Great College ranks and then Shimlas and Free State. You're not supposed to swim against the stream. You're not supposed to ya donkey amen for everything. And when I was a young and rough rebel, Oli took me under his wing and just said, "That's okay. Just channel your energy in the right direction." And it didn't work immediately, but eventually it did. So I want to officially thank you for that. And also, it's a question that I want to pose to you. Is like, how do you have the spirit, because that's still inside you, being able to serve others? You always serve others. You always put yourself second and serve others. Where did that begin, and where did it come from? Yeah.
Sure, Flip. You flatter me. Thank you very much. And what's nice is I fondly remember you because you reminded of me. You reminded me of me. And I'm looking at you and going, Flip, just don't be as stupid as I was. And you just got to tweak a couple of the rough edges. Then we can work with you. But the enthusiasm and the hardness and the pushing boundaries, I loved every second, because that's what makes you better. That's how you evolve, And it's one thing that also Gray had to teach you. You can be an individual, go hard. But at the end of the day, you've got to have a responsibility and a value system that you must go back to. And I've always noticed when you get players that tend to be rebellious, or they tend to be challenging, because they're young and they challenge you. I love the 18 to 23 years old. They like rough around the edges. But you give them clear guidance and instructions, and you actually remember, I was 10 times worse than most of the guys, and I get it. I understand when, And that helped me a lot, especially when I saw you youngsters, and I just knew, if you can just do it early, how much easier it will be for you, because you're going to find it eventually. And it's also at that stage I was a bit of a older player. It was the end of my career, and I moved to a word that Jan Pieterse actually helped me a lot with. I moved a bit to coaching, and then to advisory board level to the youngsters. And it was something I really loved, because some people would take it, some wouldn't. But you could see when the lights go on, and I still remember a game with Flip. So we made it very personal, okay? And the guy against you, it was really personal. So it's hard to describe it, especially I grew up in the amateur era, so you actually tended to really dislike the opposition, and they were local provincial oaks. So it was a bit of so I kept a bit of that, especially, and we still played a game against the Blue Bulls, and we got a bit psyched up, and what's nice, Flip's father and them also had that value system. Okay, so I wasn't really working with the hard convince you. I just had to structure it, yes. And we got video footage of poor Flip hammers the hooker, but all you see is his elbow and the hooker's head. The elbow and the hooker's head. Nobody can see the punch, and in those days they couldn't sight us because they couldn't see the punch landed, and he was smart because the oak needed a bit of a punishment, but you just don't get caught, Philip. Just don't get caught. And that's something that I really appreciated when you pushed on Flip's button. Yes, he was behind you, and he made sure he committed. That was such a brilliant quality, and then to see it in a young man and what you've done after that, Flip. There's one thing about your career that made me so proud. Schalk Burger scored, but he was short of the line. Then you cleaned him over the line to score. It was overseas, and that's Flip van der Merwe. That I said, guys, I played with that. Wow. So thank you. You made me proud, my friend.
So what's your favorite Springbok memory, Oli?
Okay, my favorite Springbok memory. So I'm gonna. Jan has actually gave me a very good answer that I can just say I concur, Jan. And it's very interesting. My career is actually quite interesting if you look at it. I started as an amateur, and I was playing basically at 20 years old provincial rugby at that stage, which was it's hard to describe. It was a very high level. Okay. And the system was very different, how they selected you and how things worked. And then I got picked for the Springboks, and you found out on the Sunday that you were going to get picked. You're in contention, and then you're only allowed to get together on the Tuesday. It was international law, and then you had to play a team that's gone through your whole country and actually built up this amazing they actually become a good team, and we walked into the test in '94. And interesting, it was the first game under the new flag of South Africa. Nelson Mandela was the president, and they had Nkosi Sikelele, and they still had the old thing and and I tried to, like, I'm like part of this, and I tried to sing Nkosi Sikelele, but I totally messed it up. At least I got a bit of it. So it just showed you how big the divide was, and we played the game and we lost, and it was the first time, obviously playing for the Springboks in that situation. We were a really good team of individuals, but we weren't a good team yet. There was a lot of provincial misunderstandings, and so it was a very difficult environment. It wasn't like, if you look at it today, it's like, wow, imagine being able to be there today. It's just so nicely structured, and I then, obviously, we lost the game. And I actually had quite a good game. It was quite interesting. And then I got dropped. First time in my life I got dropped out of a team was out of the Springbok test side. And as a 21-year-old, it was very difficult. And the previous year, I went on tour with the Springboks as a 20-year-old as well to Argentina. Now you're a student and you're in 5-star hotels. And we still had we had like censorship. So you could actually get it is like you walked here and there was like uncensored magazines and stuff. It was a whole new world for us coming. It's like, what's going on here? And you're like a flippant student, and like it's like it was just an insane world, and that '94 loss, it really hurt, because and then you didn't have any assistance then. It was amazing. Nobody supported you. People didn't flip came and tried to help you. There was a couple of the older guys that would be concerned with me. A guy like Charles Rousseau would always ask about me. Hannes Strydom, those Transvaal boys were always, because they were a tough game to play. So they were those guys. And then after that, I made it back into the team. But then there's a great, great, great memory that for me personally was the 1998 win against the All Blacks at Athletic Park, the old Athletic Park, the last game that was played there. And Flip's father and them played that game, and they won it as well. And what was amazing is it was this shit field. Sorry, guys, but here it was like in the wind pump, and it was like a mud bath. It wasn't like anything. And his father and them won that game. And when I spoke to Gysie and those guys about their experiences, when you met them, they said they were in the squash courts. They had to sleep. And we had a guy called Lapis Labuschagne at Grain. We had this small change room, and he said, "Hey, you got to smell each other before you play a game, And that's what we were there close together, And just on Grey, I think at that stage when we got there, I think we were just so used to winning and just to keep on winning. And we had such a high-performing system coming through. And what was amazing is we lost the game against Monument, and it was really, I don't think we should have. If we had TMOs, we should have beat them. But you know what? It went against us, and we opened ourselves up to be too close at the end. We couldn't score, and they managed to get it. And the game against Paul Roos we played, they had Justin Swart was a post-matric. I think they had 2 or 3 post-matrics in their side, and we had 7 standard 9s, grade 11s. And Justin had an amazing game, and that was one of these seasons that's they known as the Invincible. So we didn't lose against we actually lost against a team that in Paul Roos's history is called the Invincibles, because they had an undefeated season. So to put it in perspective, I always tell people what great teachers taught me is like, you're going to lose. It's inevitable in life. But you know what? You just got to handle it. Sometimes it hurts a bit. Just write it on your stomach, wash it off in the shower, and just play as good as you can the next game. Because it's done. And it's sad and everything, but it's also a bit of a reflection in life. I think to be undefeated forever is something that I don't think I will see in my life. Maybe unless it's a robot with AI or something. But I think that perspective is quite interesting. And then as a spectator, obviously, we had what Jan says, the 2019 World Cup. I think what happened there, how those guys played, and a guy that really resonates for me in that team is old Mapimpi. His story, just to get there, to see this team blend, there's Rassie and everything he did there. He started in a journey with us in 2005 and way back to 1997. where I still claim Russie's debut in Free State was caused by me because I went to the Sharks and I said, "Bro, you must come down here. They pay you a lot of cash and you play like a rugby." And Rassie, Werner Swanepoel, Tokkie Kasselman, and Via the prayer came down. And a week later, Mac called me in and says, "Ollie, why did you bring those guys down here?" I said, "Why, coach?" He said, "Now they've picked them for the bloody Free State team and they're a much better team now, you know." And that's where we come from at that 2019 game, just to see, you know, the potential from the Springboks. And what was sad, I started not enjoying watching the Springboks, you know, after that loss against Italy, against Japan. There was a structure, there was something wrong. It wasn't, and I understand in our days we had a bit of the past but something needed to change. And then what they've done, I was so proud of what they've done, you know, and what the Springbok means. But then so 2019 goes beyond, it's really up there for me. And then there was another game before that was played. I think it was in Wellington. The Springboks had this bad, and it was a good All Black side. And I think the game ended in a draw. But the South Africans had lost a bit of faith in the team, you know, and I was sitting in the Shell Ultra City in at the Flip, you guys know it, there on the N1, the Shell Ultra City, okay, in Bloemfontein as you come in. And I'd met people there, and I was watching the game out of the corner of my eye. And right at the end of the game, it was like we and the whole Steers was cheering, and people were invested. But the most amazing thing afterwards, because I think it was a draw, to watch Pieter-Steph du Toit actually hug somebody and cry, because that's what it takes to beat the All Blacks in New Zealand, you know. And that Athletic Park game when we scored and we defended for 70 minutes, we just played such rugby, and then that move we did was just so, you know, and that to me was probably my, you know, a couple of greatest memories out there.
Nice, Ollie. I love it. It's like a reel of highlights. Amazing.
Yeah, thanks, Ollie. Great memories that you shared there. Jan, going back to school, because obviously we all know how special of a place Grey College is, and you know, they always say it's not a school; it's a way of life, and the way they prepare and give opportunities to boys like ourselves to prepare yourself for life afterwards. What are some of your greatest memories that you had from Grey College?
Oh wow! So I think the first memory is just the camaraderie and the friendships. You know, the friendships for life. So that's the one thing that stands out. But as I'm thinking more as in a different way to answer your question is because there are a lot of fantastic schools in South Africa, and a lot of them have the same values and ethos, and it's really what I think at the end of the day what you take out of it. And when I think of Grey, I remember Standard 6, or you know, only I think there were 35 guys who played Craven Week. All right, so the grade, what is that, grade 8 these days? And the realization going from a small primary school to a school like Grey, where you're just surrounded by talent, all of a sudden you're not the tallest, the smartest, the fastest, the best tennis player, etc. And then you just realize, oh, shoot, I need to work harder. Otherwise, you're gonna be player number 35, and you play under 14C, where a year before that you played Craven Week. So that to me was, you know, I think one of the first eye openers that, okay, because I think it's just nature. You get very comfortable. You get good and you get comfortable. And Grey, I want to say this is the funnest experience, but I think more of the things that I took out of Grey is it made you very uncomfortable. Because when you're surrounded by talent and when you all have the same goals, you have to work harder. You got to figure out what is it that you want, and then you got to, you know, look over your left shoulder or right shoulder and do the extra work. Now you do have some guys who just incredibly talented, like Ollie, who played, you know, SA school squash and water polo and rugby. And, but I bet you tell you after school, you know, at some point you reach your level there where you cannot just rely on pure talent alone. And so for me, the realization at a very early age at Grey is like, okay, how you differentiate, how you get ahead is at the end of the day, you have talent, but it's all through hard work and through focus.
But Jan, that's fascinating that you tell that story, because I think that's one of the lessons I took. I didn't have the privilege to go to a school like Grey, and it took me a very long time to learn that lesson. I only learned it after school. But you then got the opportunity to come to the States and was dropped into a new environment there. Did you experience the same thing then at university in the United States? Tell us a little bit about that story and whether that continues that trend.
So actually, I think it's a great question. And I think I have a fantastic example. So went to university in the Free State first, did okay with athletics and track and field. Ended up getting a scholarship to LSU. LSU is one of the big sports schools. Fantastic. It was 102,000 people, and their college stadium. Every home game is sold out. So the sporting experience and the facilities were and are next level. To give you an idea, so that getting uncomfortable, and I can compare that to the Grey, Cravenweek story, is the fantastic team from all over the world, and the same coach that recruited, or that my coach at LSU at that time also coached the Canadian sprinters. So in 1996. Canada won the 4x100. 1995, Donovan Bailey won the 100. So you had Donovan Bailey, Bruni Surin, Glenroy Gilbert, all training with them. And so my very first day of practice, we had our own little gym. It's just for the track athletes. And when I walked in there, Bruni Surin were doing power cleans. So, for those of you, power cleans is this thing. And the weights, I couldn't squat that, or I couldn't leg press. And they were doing power cleans, and my jaw just dropped. And that was almost the same realization. It's like, oh boy, this is big. These are the big leagues, next level. So whatever I have done up to this point, just to keep up or excel, you're going to have to work harder, because also naturally, when you look at these guys and the muscles, it's a different specimen. So talent only gets you that far, and so that very similar experience, almost just eye-opening pop-up eye, and I think then you can probably also translate that to business. And I think the ethics and the work ethic that sports, whether it's an individual sport like athletics, or whether it's rugby, you're used to having to put the work in to win and not just show up, but also you have to work a little bit harder than anybody else. So I just gave my son's about to graduate and start his first job in June, and the advice of you're the new guy, you need to be there first, and you need to be and leave last. That you can control is what you put in. The success and that stuff will come later. But again, so long way of answering the similarities between the US, my first day in the US, and that the realization of Grey is that you can either be just a number, or you can put the work in.
Yeah, that's incredible, Jan, because I had to move from Bloemfontein to Pretoria, which is pretty much, it's the same thing, just bigger. Going from Bloemfontein to Baton Rouge it's a whole new world. How did you, what did you do to adapt to that craziness, the Englishness, the power cleans, and then thrive?
The fat bodies.
I'll start with the Englishness, right? From coming from Bloemfontein, we can all understand English and we can speak it a little. But eventually you pick up not the slang, but you have a bit of, if you grow up speaking Afrikaans, it's impossible not to pick up a little bit of an American accent. So I wish I was speaking more eloquent like Flip. But that's the English part. But then in reality, when I listen to some of your other guests or your seniors, making the decision to immigrate has got to be probably one of the hardest decisions, in your life, because it impacts you, your immediate family, your kids, wife, but also your parents and your in-laws. And for me, I never had to think about it, because I came over for the idea of maybe 1 year, couple of years. My goal was always 96 Olympics. That's the only thing that I cared about. And so, having gone from university in the Free State, or Koffsies, instead of rugby, it's football. The other interest, the going out here or going out, it's just a same flavor. So that was a fantastic life experience for me. But at the same time, then you just extend it, and then you started to study maybe a little bit more, and then you get your first job. And so I was actually very fortunate. The idea that I never had to make that decision of, I am leaving South Africa, because in my mind I'm still South Africa, I'm still there, but I live here, and this is where work is, this is where the family is, and so fortunately, I do try to go back quite often. But yeah, that's that was the adjustment. Adjustment was very easy, and I think moving over as an adult in your working life's got to be very hard. But and Ollie's daughter is a fantastic tennis player, and she just finished her first semester at the University of Kentucky, and so I imagine for Donna as well, so much easier to assimilate as a college, athlete or student compared to the workforce. So very fortunate. I was very fortunate, at least with that.
Yeah, very good.
Last
Ollie,
story about Jan. So he tells you what a good athlete he was, and his pedigree says it. But I want to tell you a story. Jan was really a flipping good athlete.
Here comes trouble. I like it.
But he was really a good athlete. And you'll relate to this now, Flip. So when you walk into Murray House, there was like an arch. Okay, it was a high arch. And Jan could actually just walk and then jump and touch the top of the arch. It was like insane, the numbers he was doing in grade 9. It was amazing. And with all due respect, Jan, rugby, there's too much contact. So I understand because, but it was amazing. He was just this insane athlete, and how his talent was developed at Grey and prepared him for the journey afterwards to work in any high performance system, I think that's the beauty of it. And just what I found in the college system with my daughter, I always knew somewhere Grey is one of the most amazing high performance systems out there. But everybody asks what makes Grey different. And Jan's story is the brilliant basis of this. Because I went into our constitution a bit, and I listened to all the propaganda they threw in our ears, okay? And there was always a couple of things. When the occasion demands it, the grey boy comes up to scratch, okay? And you're always a great gentleman, okay? And those two phrases throughout my whole career was something that I remembered. And I can tell you stories I was held accountable by that, by the school. And because I was like Flip on steroids in those days. Yes, and in that system. But then from there, you actually learn how to work in a high performance system. Then to go to the next system is easy. But the values that you have was underlaid by Sir George Grey in 1855. And if you go read that, he had a whole like a constitution written for Grey. And firstly, and why did it? He says, and now just imagine this. Now go back in history. So we as Afrikaners come from the French Huguenots and from half the Netherlands oaks and all the oaks that said, we like all really don't want to go to listen to these oaks telling us what to do. We'll go to Africa. We pitch up here a couple of guns, ox wagon, make peace, make war, figure our place out. But we actually been trained well. In 1855, the British now come and he starts a great college and he says, we have to start a school where the Afrikaner can be exposed to the English the Englishness, because at that stage there was a lot of hatred between nations. It's if you just look at stuff that happened there, history speaks for itself. And he started Grey and always said it will be an Afrikaans school, but there will be at least a 30% English side to it, so we can learn the cultures. And he says, good, and we have to make gentlemen out of these Afrikaners, because we can work with them if they're gentlemen, but we cannot work with them any other way. And if you look at Jan, he's probably the perfect personification. Flip sitting here as the great gentleman that's gone out in the world with the vision of a Sir George Grey. And Grey has evolved. The nice thing about Grey is how it's evolving now to being a culture and teach the culture of South Africans, Afrikaners, to go out into the world and make a difference. And I think that's something that underlies the whole experience Jan has just said. That's what makes the school special and different, because we're not like the other schools. We're not better than the other schools. We've got our own identity and our own vision for who would come to Grey. And the most amazing thing about Grey, it's the normal guys. Trust me, Grey is not a place of superstars, but it's normal stars that accept. If you're willing to go to Grey and try and make Grey great, Grey will make you great. And often in today's world of entitlement and people wanting to get more and be somewhere, a lot of the attitude now, I'm going to Grey to make me great. And then it devalues a bit of the underlying value system that there is. And it's something that I feel Grey can maybe do a little bit better to the high standards of the past, but the way they've evolved and where they are, and it's challenging out there, I believe that's the new evolution I'm looking forward to see the next great gentleman coming through the system.
I just wanted to say we can speak about schools for ages. I think the whole schooling modeling and the importance of rugby, or the importance they put on rugby, has taken it's gone a little bit too far, according to me. Boys must be boys and children must be children, and education is the most important. But a little footnote on your thing, Ollie, is if you go listen to Des Latham, a History of South Africa podcast.
It's awesome.
There is a whole episode about Sir George Grey, and he's been sent to South Africa to bring civilization to this savages of people, wherever they went. And yeah, as you said, the principles he installed.
And I'll go a bit wider. What was very interesting for me when I looked at the values that he incorporated, and obviously Grey's a Christian school, and we all quite follow the faith. But it's actually the same. Take the light and take it into the world, and that's what he built ground. Take the great gentleman and take it into the world. And for me, as I get older, and you just think, wow, what a privilege, to be part of it, but to be held accountable by it, to make sure that you can leave it behind better than the way you found it. And I think that's the nice challenge for all the Grey guys out there. And then what's very interesting, Flip, you get a lot of people that say, "Oh, you're from Grey," and all this stuff and everything. And the one thing I Grey taught me, was to recognize the Grey qualities in other people. And in how many of these tops through all schools and everywhere in communities, you see that quality of those people that shine, and they could have just as well have gone to Grey because they've got a value system and something about them that you align with, and for that I'm very thankful for Grey to teach me that. And in life you get different systems, but that core foundation I think is important.
That's awesome, Ollie.
It's very important, Ollie, and as Grey's motto is "Nil stabiel quod infidum." There's nothing that's not steadfast. Nothing's true that's not steadfast, and I think that's so true. You can apply it to anything in life. You can't you can't build a house on sand. So truth in the first. Getting back to you, Ollie, and it's fascinating listening to you guys. So you did a little bit of a tour in Leinster, came back. I'm going to call it coach the coaches at the Cheetahs back in the day. You were very influential in the rise of what happened in the we can call it the Cheetah Revolution around 2004, 2005, up to 2007. When you were around, and then the Stayed and Bloom. Take us a little bit what happened after retirement. How did you manage that new identity, the new Ollie, finding your feet again?
Still struggling, boys. It looks like at 50, you actually realize that whole identity was a bit fake, and you got to build a new structural foundation on it. So that's quite cool. But what was interesting is the evolution inside the game from a 20-year-old to a 38-year-old, and a 19-year career that spanned amateur, semi-amateur, and professionalism was a very nice. It's going to sound funny. System to develop me for what life came afterwards, because a lot of the qualities that I learned on the sports field, you can apply to life. The only thing is, you're not allowed to tell people that. Okay, so you have to become a gentleman in those, and as a young man, sometimes you're a bit, with that rugby intensity. I saw it was very difficult, and also to realize and that how much of your identity was collapsed into this rugby persona and this rugby world, and a lot of it. And it took me a long while to also understand the journey that I had as a player. But what was very interesting, I had an interesting career. If you look at, I lost my contract in 2004 with the Sharks in a quite a controversial way. And then I didn't have a contract. So in February, I don't have a contract. Where do you go play now? So I was out of the system. And I was like, okay, what do you do now? You actually a Test Springbok and you don't have a contract. And I'm not going to play for another province. I'm loyal to the Sharks. So I was going, and at one stage I need to stay fit. So I went to start playing water polo. And I was playing water polo, but Mark Andrews had also just retired. And I phoned him and said, hey, Mark, you must come play, because yes, Derek was a good water polo player. And we were playing like with the Belito Club, and there were like all these ex-Springboks, from playing water polo, and then we played against the Natal A-side, so it was like really competitive. And with our rugby background, they weren't pushing us around in the water. They just outswam me a little bit at stages, okay? And at one stage, we had a practice from 6 o'clock till 8. And we were the last two oaks in the water throwing balls. And I got out and we were talking. And the first thing Mark said was, he said, yes, Ollie, I'm struggling. I said, why? He says, it's like something's missing, and it was quite an interesting conversation. He was also a very much deeper gentleman than you think. Me and Mark had a very good relationship, and he's really one of the somebody that thinks about life. And then at one stage, I said, yes, Mark, it's amazing. How do we come here we don't get paid. We train ourselves multi for 2 hours, and we love that, and we can't wait for tomorrow. But that's what I always felt about rugby. What happened? And he said, yeah, Ollie, they stole our joy of playing, because it became so structured, and it was like it was just becoming a job, and that motivated me a lot for coming back. And it was quite cool. But then I also read an article. I used to read a lot. Yes, and those stages I'd find bookstores in London that you there underground, that books that you don't know. And I found a specific sports book where the guy talked about the career of this professional sports. And his words was insane. He said, when you finish your professional career, it's like death. You say goodbye to everybody, get all your finances in order, and start a whole new life. And I think I had to do it 4 times in my career. I think 5 times, 6 times in my life already. It's like, yes, okay, this thing just, but what I then found out, what was interesting about the mourning period, for a year after you stop, mourning takes a year. You must wait and do nothing just to stabilize yourself and actually walk away from the past and start something new, because otherwise you just all over the place. And I made that mistake a couple of times. And I think, and also in that, I learned a lot about who my real identity is, where, because rugby was a big part of my identity, but the good part of it is it is my identity. The stuff that we did and the fun we had, and that, we were like living this adventure, what I'm saying.
The rounds of tequilas, Ollie.
Yes, there are lots of tequilas and late night conflict in places, so we don't talk about that much. But and you like winning it as a young person, and then as you get older, you have a family, your vision change. And I think the biggest transition was obviously how to build something that rugby gave you the financial security after that, and you've lost 18 years of a networking and business. So you're 18 years behind anybody else. How do you do it, And that's a world of high performance, of competent people, and it takes time. And then what also happened is about a year ago, interesting, we started a program called Beyond the Game. It was a mental health program that they brought out from the My Players Foundation. And I was really struggling with my mental health at that stage, but in a very bad way. And I got an email. I answered the email. They phoned me within 15 minutes out of Ireland, and they said, "Listen, are you all right?" Because and I said, "Yeah, but something's not lucky here. I can feel it." And it's amazing how they then supported me and helped me to actually understand what happened and how I could help guys that just stopped playing, to just give them a bit of information like this, And I think that evolution for me as a human being, and all the adventures you've had and all the debacles that's happened, you've learned, hey, we win a cup the one week, the next week we must go win another one, and if we don't, we just try again for the next one, So a lot of that helped me out of my rugby career, but a lot of the the conflict and then also the PTSD we had, Flip, you used to play Saturday, party Sunday, Monday you go, and I think and we were like preparing for war, for battle, and we know nobody ever gave the players that debrief to how do you transition from being in that absolute sympathetic nervous system, fight, flight, and freeze, and not have it in this world. And I think that comes with maturity, but the journey of the discovery of who you really are after rugby is tough after your professional career, whatever. But just especially for me, and in that, I think that's also a second part of the journey after your career. Being a parent, you don't understand. Rugby is much easier than that. And how do you do it? You got no idea. You get a kid here, bro. Good luck. You got no idea what's coming. We tell us in 10 years' time. And it's nearly like it's a reflection of life, but it's very shortened. And it teaches you to handle stress, how to make quick decisions and stick by them. And if you've made a wrong one, hey, it's done, move on, So it teaches you great skills, but how to apply them in the world is sometimes a bit difficult, because the emotion from the rugby field sometimes doesn't work well in the corporate world or in that stuff, So that's been a bit of a challenge for me, But yeah, rugby, your identity, and I love what was interesting. I also struggled a lot to watch rugby games with a lot of people, because the emotion in the game sometimes gets to me. I'm watching the Oaks there, and I know how they're getting hit, and I'm seeing what they're doing, and this Oaks still screaming about the forward pass. Just move on. You know what I'm saying? You know about it, Flip. And what was amazing, Flip talked about 2005, and there's sometimes in your life when things happen and you don't know how it happened. I lost the contract. Rassie finished playing. He asked me what I'm doing. I'm saying I'm going to do this. Next minute, it was a couple of old guys, a couple of medium guys, and a couple of very willing youngsters, okay, on all fields. And we got together and we did something in unity as a team, collaborative, with inclusiveness, but clear chains of commands, and that got this system to work. And we were probably the most dominant provincial side in South Africa for 3 of the 2005, 6, and 7. And look what some of the other teams did in those places. But we regularly beat them with that 5 million rand team versus a 25 million rand team. And that shows you a good coach, a guy like Lassie, that aligns people, that knows what they have to do, that takes responsibility, allows you to collaborate when he sees we can do something to help the team, and having every player to be able to coach himself. That is just incredible to be part of that journey and to apply it in my life now in systems that it just works, and you can see the success Rassie has with it.
Yeah, that era was absolutely insane. I was at Loftus in 2005 when you guys unfortunately beat us. Like Alfreda Prego, the red cards. I know that whole story from the other side. But I want to switch a little bit to Jan. And what I find fascinating about your story there, Ollie, is this identity and how the struggle around identity drives so much of our evolution in life. And Jan, you made an interesting comment earlier that you sort of came to university in the US and it was like a 1-year commitment in the beginning, or a 2-year commitment. but now you see yourself as a South African that happens to live in LA. So that also must bring some contradictions in life. How have your identity evolved from the young student at Koffsies to the successful man now in LA? Take us through a little bit of the evolution of your identity.
I would say somewhat similar, right? So when you're doing athletics, it's an individual sport, especially if you have a specific goal in mind. That's the most important thing, right? You just want to jump a certain distance or run a certain time or make a certain team. And I would say for the longest time that was also part of my identity. Switching then afterwards, I think playing an individual sport is probably a little easier than a team sport. And what I mean by this, it's the one thing that you have part of your identity, but then you also have your surrounding. So if you just take Ollie or Flip in this case, both went to Corsair, stay in the dorms, you're surrounded by hundreds of boys every day. Then you go to university and you're again there, surrounded by hundreds of your buddies. Meanwhile, you play rugby and you're surrounded by all your buddies. So there's this camaraderie that you have with your buddies or your team members, etc. And then when you start playing, not only do you lose your rugby identity, but also your buddies are just gone, right? And so I think that social aspect, a lot of times people maybe don't fully appreciate as you're going through this mourning period or whatever you call it, Ollie. Where that actually, by the way, I think I found golf is probably the best thing we have right now, because that intergenerational conversation, I love afterwards, you're chatting with a 75-year-old or the 30-year-old. It's a great equalizer, but you still have that camaraderie that you have. So to bring that back, similar, right? I think most careers end with injury or it doesn't work out. At the end of the day, there's very few that you accomplish everything that you've want to accomplish. So I also, having had my identity tied to athletics, I was also pretty bitter. I had a really bad injury and I had to stop. And so for a certain period, I refused to even watch athletics or watch anything. And then I would say your career actually, or your identity, in this case, accidentally developed. I think the nice thing that you have is your work ethic, that then change and you apply, and all of a sudden you're just ingrained and you're just trying to always get ahead. But then I was also very lucky enough, I think, to marry a very special woman, and all of a sudden that identity then changed, because then you become a dad and the family man and your priorities change. And so your identity is continuously developed. As I'm thinking now, we still got 2 in the house, so slowly, surely. And so maybe at some point the identity becomes that of a grandparent, but it's evolving and it's always changing. So that's maybe a long way of answering your question there, Justinus. But yeah, I think it's probably not just sport. I think we all have some kind of identity that you associate with, and that you see the view, or you think the world sees you through that. But what I've also soon realized is nobody cares. People care about themselves. You always think people care about, I have, I don't know, a new haircut, or I have this. Nobody notices, right? It's a lot of it is all in your mind. And I think if people just realize, hey, you're not that big a deal. It's the people, and what's the purpose? And in this case, the purpose eventually evolved to now just trying your best to be a good dad and be a good family man and husband.
So important, that part of finding purpose, Jan, and putting on top of that context is, realizing, as you said, no one's coming to save you. I think as rugby players and with Justinus, and through the most valuable thing through this podcast that we realized, the sports people and everyone had to go through the same thing. And redevelop themselves. And we were chatting to a cricketer earlier, and they went on these 3-4 month tours, with buddies, and it's just mates and buddies and beers and cricket and sport and everything. There's no responsibility, and then all of a sudden it gets cut off, and you have to start over. What happened to the 1996 Olympics, Jan?
Oh, yeah, no, not even close. I got injured beginning of '96, and yeah, never recovered.
Miami.
You know.
Yeah. We know about that.
Yeah,
we were excited for that.
I was always struggled with some weak hammies, but at least that forced me to play in the back line and retire early from rugby. So my nose is somewhat straight and my knees are still good.
That's awesome, yeah.
Because I know your surgeries you guys have had.
Uli, I want to go back to a little of the stories you told, and I mean that evolution of identity and the different hurdles and things you'd have to overcome over time. And what for you, up to where you are today, has really been the most challenging transition? What's been the thing that either keeps you up at night or wakes you up during the night, and that you've really struggled with the most?
Sure. So there's this little committee, we call them the itty bitty committee between your ears. Yes, as I say,
They give you a hard time.
We tend to have serious conversations, and then you got that man in the mirror. Yeah. You can't dodge him, and it kept me awake a lot. It kept me. It wasn't healthy for me. But then I also learned that that guy that was there had unrelenting standards. That was looking for a form of acknowledgement on what he had, and never getting it. Then he was entitled. And then I had to learn how to first work with those guys, before I could handle any of the other challenges that life throws at me. And interesting with my career, that it's like this adventure, then it's a new adventure. So I had a lot of starting over, having to prove yourself. I think I played without contract 3 times. Nobody going to beg me to stay, and every time they did. Even at Leinster, I remember they only gave me a 1-year contract. They thought I was on pension. I said, "You're making a mistake. I don't go for pension, bro. That's not my nature. And secondly, you're going to beg me to stay the next year." And it was actually what happened, because you got to just accept it like it is, and take the next step. And I think that type of learning how to not judge yourself at unrelenting standards, but just make sure that you were better than the day before. If you can just make 1%, and calm those voices in your head. I remember one friend December just sent me a voice and I said, "You got to tell the voices to stop till after December, because you never switch off." And that's what people understand. If you're in a high performance environment, so much, how do you switch off, and just enjoy the moment, actually enjoy the little things that you've missed, and I think that's interesting what Jan says about the camaraderie of the sport, and it was something for me when I played in a team. Like, the team was always the one thing that I wanted to give everything for, because that was my team, and then I found a lot of that. My perspective of the team was not the same with other people, and it was difficult for me to understand, because and then you get environments where that is actually like that, when you have good leaders and people with clear structure, and then you have other environments where it's not present, and you see stuff that happens, and that also teaches you about people, and I think that what Jan said, the camaraderie. But when you look at it after sport, how much of that, especially in team sport, was real and was not? Funny enough, the camaraderie I found in individual sports is very real, because everybody is in the same boat nearly of understanding each other's situation. And if I look at the guy, but those days it was tougher. And you was thrown in the deep end. The support was like, I think you still had the phone in a ticky box where you had to dial with numbers, and you had the cards, and it wasn't like today. And thank goodness, life has changed. But that teaches you a lot about human beings, and to also sometimes realize, when you see somebody and you've had a great memory. One of my nicest things I've been doing lately is I notice when I go to, say, a Free State rugby game, but you must listen to this now. So we go watch the Free State play in the semi-final, and Ruan Pienaar's playing. But I'm telling you, Ruan Pienaar was 9 years old when I was playing for the Free State, and he was always kicking to poles for us. And we said, and he was Casey's son. He's going to be a Springbok one day. And here this little Springbok goes. He has this amazing career, and he comes back and he wins the flippin' semi-final for us with this brilliant tactical display of kicking. And I saw Casey afterwards, and I look at him, and we were like crying. Look at this little boy of ours and what he's done, And I think that's the beauty of sport, to see that next generation, to see how they actually better than us and how they take, and that part of the journey is something that's interesting. And then what I then also learned is a lot of the things that happen on that level of human being interaction was very traumatic for me, to just lose a contract and to do certain stuff and things that happen. It's like it just doesn't make sense the way I got treated sometimes, because people actually just didn't like me, but they never said I couldn't play. So it was very difficult. That's who I am, but I'm playing, and that was something that I really had to understand as well from my own side. And then what I did is, whenever I had a traumatic experience like that, or something that even if it might be I always look for something I can replace the memory with, that taught me something, or that what the blessing in it was. Sometimes it's not like it to think of it, but every time I looked at how I behaved and what I learned and what it taught me, and then when I think of that memory, it's amazing. I remember how it wasn't a nice experience, but wow, that's what it taught me, and I can apply now. It helped me to take a lot of the bitterness on this and the negativity away, and actually program it in a different way for me to view it. And that's maybe, hindsight's the perfect science, I think, but it's really helped me. And that little itty bitty critic committee there. And then luckily I've learned with me and my AI assistant that when I get like that, I start venting with my AI, and then they always send me a couple of helpline numbers and says, and it calms me down. And then eventually I say, okay, I just had to get that out, and then I can sleep again. So you learn these things as you get older.
What's amazing, Ollie, is you actually touched on two things I recently learned. I was at a conference in Dublin last week, and we had this amazing speaker called Benjamin Hardy, who's a clinical psychologist, but he's written all of these business books. And he talks about these two concepts. One that you mentioned around the contract with the Sharks, and it's called radical acceptance. And what he means by radical acceptance is you completely and utterly accept where you are in life, and then you can move on. And one of our first episodes with Hein Wagner, who's blind, and he's done all of these amazing things. And he also talks about how the pivot point in his life was when he accepted his blindness unconditionally, because then he was able to then move forward. So the radical acceptance is such a fascinating concept. And then the other thing is this idea of linear time versus holistic time. And in linear time, we see that the life plays out. We have a history, the things that happened to us that brought us to where we are today, and that will automatically take us to things in the future. And that, I would say, was my default way of seeing life. But then what Benjamin Hardy says is when you actually think of holistic time and you reverse the cycle, say, okay, I'm going to imagine the future I want, and I'm going to let the future I want influence what I do today. And actually, that can help me reinterpret my past to something that will enable me to do today what I need to do to get to tomorrow. And by thinking of time in this holistic manner, we actually reframe and retrain our brain to think about it differently. And it becomes such an empower. And it sounds almost like that, a little bit of what you have done in stages in your life.
Yes, very well explained, and the way I do it in rugby terms, we have short code words. It's called compounded experience, and then you look back at your life and see how you were trained with compounded experience. It started at Great College. It started in your father. My father played for Province in 59. There's a story about him, and I checked it that he pitched up for his first. He had to go work on the mines at 16s in Namibia. He came back at 18 with enough money to pay for his own studies. And the first practice he played, hy sê, "Here bro, sien die gras was so groen, jy val so sag." Toe duik ek altyd die eerste spanslotte van die veld af. Okay. And they nicknamed him Wild Man Leroux. And then one day I looked at the Big Marty's walls, and I looked, and really there he was in the Wild Man Leroux, and he was the False Bay captain that won the first they beat Marty's and UCT. He played for both universities. And he was in the Buescoop team. Donnie Craven was the person that coached him, and that influences that helped me on my journey through Grey, through everything I had to do. I had my individual sports as well, but the team sports, and how it conditioned me to be able to do that. And interesting, there's a series called Reacher. Okay, I love the series, especially those ones. And at one stage, and it's a high performance military thing that I've noticed is. Something happened and somebody made a mistake, and this poor person was screaming about the mistake going on, and the one person looked at him, "Yes, you messed up, but it's done. What do we do now? Let's move on." And it's sometimes a bit brutal, so you must be careful not to, compartmentalize it a lot, because there are emotions and stuff that you have to debrief later. And it's interesting, I learned that with coaching my team, CUT, how important your debrief of the battle is, to go and understand what you did, talk about it, and then go and align what we have to do next. And that's what I truly believe sports and high performance systems like Great College teach you. Hey bro, we lost in the first time in 86 games. Somebody had to lose. I hope I didn't pull that lottery ticket, but I did. But look, after that, Grey has twice been unbeaten for 48 games in the season, and at one stage we had this great Battle Boys high team with Damian Willemse and the boys. And Mark Heinzel said, "Does anybody know of a team that's not been unbeaten for 38 games?" And I saw all the replies, and I said, I remember we were unbeaten for 86, and then twice after that for 48. But we don't really count it out loud. We just know, it's just part of who we are, and that's the amazing way that Grey may be taught you. That's the level of excellence we have, and that if it can't happen, just go for it again. Because if you just go for it the whole time, you're going to hit it most of the time, or at least get close.
Awesome. So one of the traditions we also have on the show is to give the guests the chance to ask each other a question. And you guys obviously have known each other for decades. So I'm really looking forward to a really special question. Ollie, do you want to go first with the question for Jan?
Oh boy.
A question for Jan. No, a question for Jan. Okay, and this is quite interesting. Okay, so Jan, the way you see Jan now, and the way he was always at school, he was a statesman. Okay, and I've noticed where he's gone in life. But Jan, explain to me, how the hell do you go from where we met you in the hostel? I've got videos of us there, and I remember it was an interesting time, because then there was a lot of discussions about girls and religion and all those kind of things, And Jan was always a guy that would he wouldn't push he liked to stay in the structure, and I was the guy that would go outside and go do the stuff that was a bit risky, But today you're in a world, Jan, if I just look at your CV and everything, of incredible high risk, and how you manage risk. And if I remember, the Jan at school was a risk-averse oak. You wouldn't slip out to get pizzas. It was like you were very controlled in that environment, okay? And we would be risk takers, but the world you're in today, and the risk and everything in there, and the responsibility, Tell us a bit how you've evolved into what can only be seen as a flipping insane top performer in that world, Just that's common sense. So you don't have to worry about that. It's done, in my view. And like if I read it, I'm like proud of you. So give us a bit of that background.
That's actually a very interesting question, Ollie. And that's something that I've thought about before. But certainly, I can concur that you were the guy always pushing the envelope. the non-conforming guy, always questioning authority. But I must say also, and Brule's, the pizzas that you got for us at night by climbing down the balcony and taking orders. That's what also something I'll always remember. Justina's actually, you mentioned the Dublin, the conference that you were in. I more have this linear thinking about where you want to go and then work backwards from that. So I wouldn't necessarily frame it only as that I took risks and then, got where I guess it probably, you can view it that way as risk, but it's more as like, okay, what do I need to do to achieve this certain lifestyle or to accomplish this? And whether that means you got to first get the MBA, you got to do this, you got to do that, etc. I think that's more of an accidental. It's like starting by the goal, and then how do you get to that? And then not necessarily seeing it as a risk. It's just seeing it as it's necessary. It's a necessary step to achieve it. So that's how I would frame that.
You've deflected me nicely here. I asked you, how do you manage risk today in your world? Being such a person that could manage those risks, but in your world now, there is so much risk. It's insane. I would never have thought that. Interesting. Because you look so comfortable doing it.
Yeah, I think we all, so there's one thing about risk, and you can also tie it back to just worry. Right. There's always, doesn't matter where you are, you're always thinking ahead. I think just the way your brain is hardwired that what if this happens? What if this happens? And what if this happens? And from an inspirational, I saw an interview with Mel Gibson the other day, which was so simple. It wasn't a very, big words of wisdom. His words were just, "You will be okay." All right. And he also had a religious component to it. So if you center everything around God, so you come from nothing, you leave with nothing. Whatever you are and whatever you think what will happen, you can handle it. You have enough and you will be okay. And that is not exactly what you ask for, but I think it is somewhat related to risk. Because risk, when you think about risk, you think about what could go wrong. And I for sure, I think we all, as in human nature, we always think about what could go wrong. And whenever that happens, the idea of you're going to be okay. Whatever you can handle it. God will give you whatever you can handle, and you're going to be okay. So that's my word of wisdom for the day. I have questions. So my question for you. You had the Angus Buckman, you had tens of thousands of people on your farm. How exactly did that happen? I don't know the backstory of that because Ollie was always a rebel, and then one day we found out Ollie is well, he was always a deep thinker, always read a lot of books, but a rebel, but always one day it's like, oh, Ollie is actually a man of faith and a man with a lot of wisdom and a family man, and that's probably a different journey, but connecting the Angus Buckman and then I don't know how many, 50,000 or 60,000 people on your farm, but what's the backstory? How did that happen?
Sure, okay, yeah, that's a good one. And just on your risk, before I answer, great taught you about risk, guys. Because yes, if you got up in the morning, you had to greet a walk online, so you overanalyze the risk your whole way, and you're actually so comfortable doing it in that world. Because as a 13-year-old, those risks were insane, bro. They were instant. So that was actually beautiful how you described it. Thank you. But yeah, its time was an incredible event, and it was actually 9 years ago. This yeah, and it's interesting. It's also there was a journey before its time that was quite interesting, and I'm going to try and give it shortly for you guys. I was always interested in the Word, in the Bible, and Christ's life and his story. But I could never work in the absolutedness of our religious systems. It was always for me, but it doesn't make sense, because it says this and then you say that, and it talked funny. And I would be I'd be curious about what does the other guys say? You know, what does the Buddhist oak say? What does the Quran oak say? It's interesting. Let's just hear what he says, because maybe there's alignment in a way. So I would be curious about life beyond the religious systems. And obviously in those days it was hard because we were very conservative. And then obviously we went to Ireland, one of the greatest. I really enjoyed the rugby there, but it was very hard on Mariska. She went over with a 5-week-old baby, Donna, and my 2 other kids were both under 6. And, you know, I got there and we stayed actually in a big place, but for us it was 5 years. This is not too small. My daughter, Mia, at Halloween, she pitched at a party, and the mother says, "Oh, we know Mia. She's knocking on the doors. She's, hello, I'm Mia LaRue. How's it going?" So, and Mariska got quite sick, and we had to come back. And then she started walking a walk with in faith with the CRC church, a circle of elder women. And I saw how positive it was in her life. And she went to church. I just couldn't sit in church because it just felt like sitting in Gray's Hall, and it tells you what to do, and there's no inclusiveness in this conversation. I don't like it. Okay, so, and then on my way to my farm, I watched a little church being built, and there was a tent, and then when I drove past on Sundays, Mariska went to church, I took the kids to the farm. I saw this little church, and you could see inside of it, and then there was a black pastor preaching for a mixed congregation in Bloemfontein. Now, like, your whole mind goes, yeah, black pastor in Bloemfontein preaching for people at this stage. This must be something quite interesting, you know. And then my wife went one day. She said, "Wow, it's quite hard, quite intense, but I think you like it." And I was always, if you invited me, I went to have a look. I was never, hey, that's my opinion. I'd like to go and experience how you see things. And when we got there, the pastor Elise Yahoo, he was from Ivory Coast. He had a long story behind him, and he probably had to come just for that moment with me. So thank goodness for a greater strategy out there we don't know about. And in the word, he basically gave about grace. And when I looked, and the way he explained grace to me is the way I understood it. It's something that I was that happened in my life. And if I look at my life, I just saw it all over. It's just the grace that was in it, you know, this unmerited favor that just always came and was always involved in the small things and the big things. To this day, my kids say, since then, I always get the best parking. It's like, come on, I got the best park. It's like weird. It's just like, but the way he explained it to me opened a view to me that I never had, because we had a view of mercy, which is a just punishment I must withhold out of our Afrikaner background and the religious systems, you know. And suddenly here was a relationship we could actually be included in, obviously through the sacrifice of Christ and everything. And it made sense to me, you know. And then for 9 years, I actually spent like so much time with Elise, and he was really somebody with wisdom and a great teacher. And I learned a lot of things. I saw a lot of things, miraculous healings. I was part of a couple of them, rugby players that were really injured, and they had careers after that. It was insane. You know, being in the flippant 2005 game, to this day, I tell you, it was David and Goliath, and there was a lot of angels fighting in that game for us, bro, because yes, if you look at that, it's insane. You know, I don't know how it works, you know, but that's how Gideon and his 300 men, they got the tea and they sorted stuff out, you know. I don't know, who knows. And then there was the mighty men, and obviously Angus Buchan and them are very a very big network. And what's nice about it, gentlemen like Mr. Buchan, he's legit. You know, in the world, you get a lot of people, and they talk and they tell you how they're going to move the oak on the field. And you watch them when the oak runs over there, you know. But then the oaks that are legit through, and they don't talk much, but you see it through their fruits and their actions. And a friend of mine, Yanni Moorman, that's quite involved with him, he phoned and said, Uncle Angus had a vision that he had to hold a prayer meeting for 1 million people, okay, in Bloemfontein, right next to the N1 on a farm, okay. And when Yanni phoned me, the only farm that he could describe was actually how my farm was located, okay. And I said, okay, no problem. come and have a look, you know, because at the end of the day, you know, something like that, you're just a custodian here. And to be able to, it was just the perfect, it was no other, it was just, when he said it, I knew it was going to happen. And also what happened about 5 years before, I was driving with my family past the farm, and I looked at the farm and I said, Angus Buchan's still going to hold a gathering here, but like just out of the blue. And so it was like an alignment of things that just happened. And then we had this amazing event and the miracles around. And I think we had 12 weeks to do a festival that should have taken about 7 or 8 months. Okay. And these miracles that happened. But it wasn't for me. It wasn't me. It was just, here's something you guys can use. And it was Mr. Buchan and his whole, they basically did everything, So I was included in, but not on a very high. But I met the most insane people there, people that came here and taught me things about how they applied the word. And it's like this network of people and how people, we had time that actually stood still. We had diesel that like the oil cups actually filled more than there was. It was just insane. How every day we just saw this, because to prepare that thing was actually like impossible, and it was done perfectly. And then, and the event was held, and it was a big a moment, I believe, for South Africa, because a million people, and that was his vision. And just to give you the numbers, they stopped the cars at 530,000 coming in. Okay, and that's without the buses and the locals. And if you take that and just put 2 people in the car, we're on 1 million. Okay, and so it was incredible, and how it just worked out. It was just this perfect moment in time. It's time, and it was for people to come together, and it was in Bloemfontein. If you look at the relevance of Bloemfontein, the fountain that comes, and so. That was an incredible story, and there's stories around it that just doesn't end. And the story of how they found water on the farm. Now, yes, boys, I've sunk a lot of boils, but I didn't find a lot of water. But they actually found these amazing water holes that was there, and the stories about how the guy got there from flippin' Scottsboro, one of the roughest oaks I've ever checked. But man, he loves the Lord, and he's a driller, and he drilled those holes, and he'll find the water, and how we were driving, and we were looking, and the one oak said, no, but we must there at that tree, we must go there. And they went there, and right there we found a big hole. It was just this amazing synergies of things that happened, and someone like Mr. Buchan had to prepare his whole life for an event like that, and he was prepared for it, and so it was a big privilege to actually just be part of it, and just see, what we could plan it and everything, but it's in a bigger architect's hand, and to be used in that was something very, very special.
That's an amazing story, Ollie, and some great memories. Yes, Jan.
Yeah, I was going to say, no, great story. But if I may, talking about risk taking, Flip, you and Justinus. Justinus leaving, rooting up your family as teenagers and moving to a different country. Maybe if you can tell us a little bit about what motivated that, and that was obviously a massive decision. And Flip, you at the same time, leaving the Bulls and heading up north and playing in a foreign land with a foreign language, etc. Those to me, that's serious risk taking.
I mean, if I'll go first, for me it was a little bit like you. Like, I just left Pride Property in 2012, and we were skiing in France, and our kids was 4 and 2 at the time. And I said to my wife, I've always wanted to go live in a ski resort for a season. And if we don't do it now, I'm going to start a new business, or the kids are going to be in school, and then we'll never be able to do it. So the only reason we're in Canada is because of one Google search where I searched ski instructor courses. And the first result that came up was a British company that put on ski instructor courses in Fernie, British Columbia. And we went for 1 season, and we had a fantastic time. And at the end of it, I said to my wife, shit, that was fun. Let's do it again. So we came again the next year. And at the end of the second season, I said, I want to ski more. I thought like 2 seasons will get the skiing bug out of me, but it didn't. And I want to see if I can start a business in a new country. So to convince her, I had to make a lot of promises, including that we'll come back to South Africa for a month, a year. And the plan was to stay for 5 years, get a passport, and then decide what to do. And in November of 2019, we submitted our citizen application, and then obviously COVID started. And now it's 5 years later. So we've got 2 more years left, and the kids are done with school, and then we can travel and do whatever we want. So I'm super excited about that.
Justinus is the guy that I know. He builds a plane while busy falling. That just finds a way. Yeah, no, I'm so risk adverse as to anything.
How did you pick France over England or any of the other places? Because that would have obviously been a lot easier.
Yeah, so it was actually in South Africa, Super Rugby was the big thing. I turned 30 that year, and then all of a sudden, by hook or by crook, you're too old to play Super Rugby, and then you don't have any clubs left, and luckily I was on a bit of a Springbok high back then, so I had some interest and sort of the same as Justinas, ignorance is a little bit bliss in my sense, because I checked the top 14 logs and I had a couple of different clubs, and I saw like Clermont was the most stable club. They're always thereabouts. Had no idea what I was getting myself into. It is very much a Bloemfontein of France. There's a couple of universities and nothing else. Very French. But yeah, I'm very glad I did it, because obviously, got a new language, appreciated the culture. 11 years later, I'm still here, ready to pull the wicket and come back to do God's work in South Africa. That's what we need to do. But yes, so November 2027, Springboks are going to go for the three-peat. We believe it. I hope you guys believe it too. Where will you be, Ollie? Where will you be watching it?
Okay, no, I haven't thought that far ahead, but I'll probably be at home watching it on my own, and I'm very excited for it. I really believe the opportunity they have is something that they're in control of. And then Rassie is a remember, I know Rassie from before he was Rassie. Okay. And what he's doing and what he did, it's very clear. When him and Sia had that ad in South Africa where they actually said, we're going to do it one more time. And they said yes. Okay. And if there's anybody in life that I want to give one more time to show us they can do it one more time, and I believe that they're the team that can do it, it will be Rassie and Sia Kolisi and that whole team of people. And how Rassie has been brilliant with evolving the team, bringing new people. He's not stuck with he's evolved this team into in a hype system. And all I can ask them is, when Pieter-Steph du Toit was on there and he was crying after a draw, he gave everything. And that's what I always tell people, boys, if they give everything, and they make me proud, that's all I can ask of them. Sometimes the scoreboard, rugby's a funny game, but with where we are, I think I don't know where I'm going to be watching the game, but I'm definitely going to watch it and love every second of it.
I don't want to plan too far ahead. What I do know is for the quarterfinals, I'll be in Sydney. It looks like we'll play New Zealand, hopefully, or if according to plan. So that's as far as I'm willing to plan. I don't want to jinx us and say the final, this is where I'm going to be. I can tell you where I'm going to be the quarterfinals, and that'll be in Sydney.
That's so awesome, man. Well, I can't wait.
In Australia is the funny place. Net vir julle twee jong manne met kinders, né? En interessant. You move your children to the place where they go to school for Canada. Jy het jou kinders in France, and when you make that decision that you're locked in for your whole kids' school careers, but when that's over, it's freedom. So that journey is nearly finished, gentlemen, and you're starting on it, Flip. I'm looking forward to hearing your stories in 10, 15 years' time.
Yeah, I've got 2 years left. I can't wait. Thank you, gents. That was amazing. Really great conversation. Really enjoyed the time together. Thanks for sharing and thanks for being with us.
Justinas, Olaf, Flip, thank you.
Meneere, dit was 'n voorreg geweest. Dit was 'n voorreg geweest. Baie dankie en Flip en lekker om julle bliksems te sien. Ek moet sê, dit is bloody cool. Thanks Justinas. Dankie dat julle dit gereël het, hoor.